Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Today, April 22, 2022, 4 o'clock Moscow time. I would like to open the meeting of the Dissertation Council for the defense of the thesis by Gonashvili Aleksandr Sergeevich for the degree of candidate sociological studies, scientific specialty 544, social structure, scientific institution processes, on the topic socialization of the Russian intelligentsia, problems, challenges, contradictions. According to the order of the Academic Secretary Aleksandr Valentinovich, dated February the 10, 2022, number 1048/1, I, Pryl Nikolai Alexandrovich, Doctor of Sociology, Professor, Head of the Department of Public Administration and Planning, Supervisor University, was appointed Chairman of the Dissertation Council. The board members of the Dissertation Council are also approved by the same order. Lebedentseva Lubov, Doctor of Sociology, Associate Professor of the Department of Economic Sociology, St. Petersburg State University. Tarandov Yelena, Doctor of Economics, Associate Professor of the Department of Economic Sociology, St. Petersburg State University. The following members take part in the remote access mode: Rusenko Svetlana Ivanovna, Doctor of Sociological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Social Sciences and Humanities, University of Physical Culture, Sports and Health named after Lethkovt. Kristin Daller, PhD, full Professor, University of Ottawa, Canada. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Спасибо.
Tamas Dotzi, PhD, Associate Professor, University of Physical Education, Hungary. Can you see and hear us as well?
Спасибо. Ответ.
Thank you. The answer is positive. The applicant himself is also present at the meeting. The scientific advisor of the applicant is also present, Doctor of Sociology, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Sociology, St. Petersburg State University, Sinutin Mikhail Vladimirovich. In order to improve the quality of the communication, I would like to ask you, my dear colleagues, including those in the remote access mode, to turn off your microphones. But please don't forget to turn them on when you're given the floor. I would also like to inform you that audiovisual broadcast is being carried out, and live broadcast is carried out on the St. Petersburg State University website. Simultaneous interpretations being carried out as well. On the broadcast screen, currently the listeners might see the email address to which all the participants might send their questions to the applicant, voice their own opinions considering the thesis itself and the presentation by the applicant, as well as the current scientific discussion, and thus take part in the scientific discussion itself. The technical services will send me the questions and I will voice them during the discussion. Questions are to be related to the thesis by the applicant and the presentation by the applicant. It is necessary to state the name, title and job of the author of the question. The questions not related to the scientific discussion, the topic of the thesis, and the presentation by the applicant, as well as anonymous questions, will not be voiced. In accordance with the procedure for awarding the scientific degree of Candidate of Science and the degree of Doctor of Science at St. Petersburg State University, in line with the local regulations of St. Petersburg State University, the Dissertation Council is considered to be valid if no more no fewer than 2/3 of the appointed members take part in it, but no fewer than 4 people. Our decision council consists of 6 people, and all 6 are present, including 3 members in the remote access mode. Audiovisual content is provided. Thus, there is a quorum. I would like to ask the representative of the Department of the Defense Offices to issue the attendance list. The procedure of today's meeting is as following. Its approximate duration is about 2 hours. First, brief information about the applicant and documents submitted by the applicant and their compliance with the established requirements. Answer to possible questions, approximately 5 minutes. 2. Brief report by the applicant on the main provisions of the study. About 15 minutes. 3 questions to the applicant strictly according to the report. No more than 2 minutes per question. Applicant's responses, no more than 5 minutes for all. Announcing external reviews, if any. Reviews by all the members of the Decision Council is turned with the assessment of the thesis and the presentation by the applicant, as well as with suggestions and remarks. About 10 minutes per speaker. Presentation by the chairperson of the assessment of the thesis, about 10 minutes. Responses of the applicant to the questions and remarks of the members of the Decision Council. 9. Open discussion. All those willing who are present at the events might be able to have the floor. The questions are to be related to the topic of the research. No more than 2 minutes per person. And all those willing to take the floor should sign in the registration sheet. And before taking the floor, it's necessary to give the full name, academic title, position, and job. 10. Voicing the questions that were received during the live broadcasts via the email address posted on the Middle State University website. I'd like to pay attention to the fact that written questions, the announcement of which might require more than 2 minutes, will not be voiced. 11. Applicants' responses, no more than 2 minutes per question. 12. Speech by the supervisor of the applicant, no more than 3 minutes. 13. Discussion prior to the open roll call. The sound of the broadcast is muted. About 5 minutes. 14. Open roll call. Vote count by the chairperson of the Decision Council with subsequent entry of the results in the minutes of the meeting. 15. Making decision awarding or non-awarding academic degree. And finally, 16. Closing remarks by the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, are there any questions about the regulations and the procedure itself? There are no objections and no questions. If none, then we'll proceed. First of all, I'd like to ask you to turn off the sound of your mobile phones. But dear colleagues who are in the remote access mode, please do not turn off your phones in order to provide prompt communication in case of a technical failure. Thank you for your understanding. So, I'm going to start the meeting. Brief report. The thesis by Gonashvili, Aleksandr, Sergeevich for the degree of the candidate of sociological sciences in the scientific major, Fight for Social Structure, Scientific Institutions and Processes on the topic Sport Socialization of the Russian Intelligentsia, Problems, Challenges, Contradictions, was accepted for defense by the order dated back to January 11th, 2022, number 36/1. Aleksandr Gonashvili conducted research in St. Petersburg State University as a postgraduate student. The scientific advisor is Associate Professor, Doctor of Sociological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Sociology, Sanuti Mikhail Vladimirovich. The number of published works that present the main provisions and the results of the defense, according to the list, are 6 works. In peer-reviewed scientific publications from the list of the Ministry of Russian Education and Science of the Russian Federation, 5 publications. In publication indicated in Web of Sciences and Scopus, 1 publication. And 4 works were published in other publications. All the documents submitted by the applicant, based on the information that I received from the curator of the defense, correspond to the St. Petersburg State University requirements, and their copies can be found in the applicant's attestation files. The curator of the defense also has the copies of the documents at hand. Before giving the floor to the applicant, I'd like to ask the members of the Dissertation Council. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, do you have any general questions to the applicant, including whether there is a need to voice the entire list of the documents submitted by the applicant for defense? No questions. There is no need to voice the entire list. No questions. Then I'd like to give the floor to the applicant. Aleksandr Sergeevich, you have about 15 minutes. The floor is yours. Good afternoon, dear members of the Dissertation Council. I'd like to talk about the thesis on the topic socialization of the Russian intelligentsia, problems, challenges and contradictions. Sport socialization is of great importance for a modern person, and it provides the reproduction of a culture of leisure activities and competitiveness. Nevertheless, sport socialization influences different people in a different way. Social conditions are important. People involved in mental labor are the subject of the research. The specifics of the intelligentsia role in social production consist in the creative research and teaching nature of their higher labor, and it gives a certain specific traits to their recreational activities. Intelligentsia needs to compensate for the lack of activity by physical and psychological recreation. Each person can notice the influence of the lack of sports leisure in different ways. Sociological approach shows that the significance and deformation of the Russian intelligentsia are closely related to changes in the labor sphere and development of capitalism, scientific and technological revolution. With economic progress, the share of mean productions is less than the share of the labor force decreases. Under capitalism, commodity circulation and the cyclical nature of economic crises leads to a constant wave of increasing investment in the sphere of non-material production and services, which include mental labor. One of the characteristics is the lack of difference between private and working life, which was revealed by Habermas as the social development of a capitalist society. If we talk about mental labor, then this trend is rather specific. The balance of work and leisure can be seen through institutional forms, sports leisure being one of these institutional forms. In the historic perspective, the wealth of the society might be considered according to the free time that people have that they can use to restore their physical and mental strength, increase their knowledge and abilities for spiritual growth. Thus, the change of the socioeconomic situation of the intelligentsia will be directed towards the increase of the importance of sports leisure. And the thesis focuses on the trends and problems that can originate from it. Sport is considered as an institution of social development which consists in competition and struggle between people and manifestation of phenomena and people with themselves, as seen by John Loy. Sports is a kind of social activity which acts as a manifestation of the basic states of human self-consciousness and self-determination. It is a full-fledged type of social activity, the sphere of manifestation and acquisition of culture, and the sphere of manifestation of creativity. The sport is a means and a form of social appraisal of highest physical, spiritual abilities of an individual or group. Social institution of sport is the identification of the need for professional improvement. Sports accumulate physiological and social characteristics. It is necessary to pay attention to the idea that sports socialization is a social process of including other institutional forms into the sports activity. Today, social structure also influences sports social development. Different social strata, classes and culture practice sports. Thus, sports accumulate the essence of modern life, of its diversity in forms, and harmoniously fits into the modern lives. And the object of the thesis is sports socialization as an institutional process through sports practices. The subject is the process of sports socialization of the Russian intelligentsia due to structural and institutional conditions. You can see the purpose and the goals of the thesis in the slide. Following the purpose and the goal of the research, a hypothesis has been put forward. That is, the participants of mental labor might suffer from insufficient physical activity, increasingly sedentary lifestyle, which leads to poor health and disharmony of lifestyle. The dominance of mental, psychological, and physiological influence leads to the blur of the boundaries between work and leisure, which determines the need for development of sports leisure. Theoretical and methodological studies are based on provisions of relational sociology and the theory of social economy of labor based on the works of Ilmeev. These allow us to generate theoretical resources of various sociological knowledge. The conceptual model of the study is found in the justification of how sports and mental work are inherent in the socialization of intelligentsia, which in turn influences social interaction and practice of sports activity. The empirical basis is a survey of public opinion among residents of St. Petersburg regarding professional and social status in relation to mental activity. 500 respondents answered the questionnaires. The scientific novelty is as following. An approach has been developed based on the principle of versatility, unity, systemic organization, the connection of mental labor and sports leisure in the Russian public space. Also, the process of socialization in the Russian society was also considered. The systematization of the function of socialization of the Russian intelligentsia was carried out. The role of sports in the productive professional activity was also assessed. Recommendations were formed to regulate the formal sports practices of the Russian intelligentsia. The theory of sports socialization has been clarified based on the view of relational sociology. The author conceptualized the forms of sports practices. Representative data was collected and analyzed, based on which practice-oriented recommendations were proposed. Certain contradictions were revealed, including the fact that the professional activity of the modern Russian intelligentsia leads to the increase of the importance of mental and moral psychological stress. And the hindrance to sports leisure is the lack of free time, which is mostly dedicated to intellectual labor. The image of sports is closely related to the idea of a healthy lifestyle. The majority most representatives of intelligentsia believe that the organization where they work, the company where they work, does not have to promote sport activities. In view of difficulties linked to technical difficulty and organizational difficulties, it was impossible to conduct the survey on all Russian scale. It was possible only to conduct a research based on the city of St. Petersburg, which for a long time has stood out because of its intellectual potential. As a result of the survey and research, three basic conditions were identified. The first factor is the desire of the intelligentsia to develop three qualities that are perceived as the main result of practicing sports, which are endurance, willpower, and purposefulness. The second factor is related to the fact that people involved in sports might be motivated by close relatives and friends. The desire to spend more time with close people serves as a motivating factor to practice sports. The third factor is the desire to improve one's health. People who are regularly engaged in sports practices believe that their health is better than those who do not practice sports. The most important driver of practicing sports during the working week for the representatives of intelligentsia is, in particular, taking care of their own health. Intelligentsia focuses on long-term, many-year, successful professional career, and the desire to prolong the effectiveness of their career. The representatives of intelligentsia understand the importance of being healthy, thus exercising. The analysis of modern sociological approaches show that sport is a social sphere. The person starts investing in health, motor abilities, which can be manifested through running, aerobics, cycling, and so on and so forth. And social is a unique social institution for development, which provides for the development of a culture of motor activity. And the involvement of a person in sports activities has an important social role. Also, the skills might be used in other spheres and activities not directly linked to sport. Universal properties and qualities of a personality acquired via sport might be of benefit for an individual, and these traits might include high discipline, perseverance, the ability to overcome failure. A special study showed that in order to solve the problem of socialization and individualization, it is necessary to use relational sociology, which allows to consider socialization as a process where social relations are the activities of an individual. The context becomes of key importance. The context of socialization determines the structure of the relationship between people during the process of socialization. Thus, socialization is a process which is linked to the interaction of an individual with the environment and integration into the social environment. Next, sports activities improve the health, transforms the personality, form individuality, promote healthy lifestyle, increases adaptive reserves. This is a kind of social testing of biological, mental, social, and spiritual state using the public evaluation system developed in the field of sport. As a result of the study, we found that leisure activities is closely related to cultural context. Leisure has complex structure, both individual and social. It arises from the contradiction and dichotomy associated with separation, integration, control, and freedom. Sports leisure are all kinds of sports aimed at recreational activities, except for professional sports, since these are not leisure practices. Sports socialization is a way to express the freedoms of the personalities. The work on the level of involvement of citizens was also conducted, and it showed that sports leisure is one of the most important forms of leisure practices. Sport as a phenomenon helps individuals to maintain their health and self-development, both physical and mental health. Sports activities are mostly motivated by close relatives and friends. 71% of respondents prefer to spend their free time with the family. The key barrier to practicing sports is lack of free time, busy lifestyle. On average, respondents rated their health at the scale from 1 to 5, and the average number was 3.5. More than half of the respondents were ready to allocate part of their budget for sports. Many believe that active involvement in the sports help in their professional activities. The main reasons for not going in for sports coincide with the key barriers, such as the lack of time. The most common frequency of practicing sport is 3 times a week, with 45% of respondents reporting that they're ready to increase the amount of time dedicated to sport during holidays. The attitude of colleagues towards sports is most often not essential for the respondents, but the presence of a friendly work team might have a positive influence on the willingness of respondents to go in for sports. Finally, we found that sports became more interested, but it did not have encouragement from the society. And the motivation, the outside motivation, is of relative no importance. Sport is viewed as a leisure activity, as a way to get approval from your colleagues, as a result of which younger population practices active lifestyle much more. However, at the moment, much attention is paid to Olympic sports, since Olympic sport is one of the highest type, is one of the highly financed types of sports. And modern sport has become less humane, and the values of humanism have been shifted towards achievement of the goal, which is manifested through Olympic sports. Dear members of the Council, thank you very much for your attention. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, do you have any questions to the applicant based only on the report? If any, you might request the floor. You have no more than 2 minutes per question. I have a question. Aleksandr, Sergeevich, could you please tell me how can your empirical study based on St. Petersburg is applicable towards Russia as a whole? As I mentioned in my presentation, I said that conducting an all-Russia research is very difficult to carry out. The foundation allocated certain financial resources to conduct a survey. Nevertheless, the funds were not enough. As for similarities, if we talk about St. Petersburg and Russia as a whole, intelligentsia, like representatives of university and so on and so forth, mostly have similar traits. Since they work at universities, for example, and then the requirements at all universities will be the same, and the representatives of this level of this type of intelligentsia, their specific traits will be similar throughout the country. Nevertheless, intelligentsia in St. Petersburg has certain specific traits, since St. Petersburg is the center of the intellectual thought of the Russian Federation. St. Petersburg sees a large concentration of intelligentsia, and the share of intelligentsia might be higher than in other cities and towns across Russia, which in turn, in my opinion, makes our research even more interesting, because we study a very specific city, St. Petersburg. And it means that it has certain distinctive traits. Thank you. Dear colleagues, has anybody else got any questions? Well, since Yelena Evgenievna asked about intelligentsia, I would like to ask about the sports. Aleksandr Sergeevich, you talk about two concepts, sport, and you even mentioned Olympic sports. And then you talk about physical education, physical culture, as it's usually pronounced in Russia. Do you have any difference in these notions when you talk about the practices among intelligentsia? And what are the differences between physical culture, physical education, and sports? Thank you very much for the question. I remember that you voiced that question in your review, and if possible, I would like to provide response later on when I'm planning to give response to all the reviews and remarks and comments that were voiced by the reviewers. So I'll provide the response later on. So we'll listen to that response, we'll hear that response later on. Dear colleagues, dear members of the Decision Council, are there any more questions related to the presentation? Yes, the floor is yours. Aleksandr Sergeevich, in the federal law on physical education and sport, sport is usually viewed as competitive activity. How common are competitive practices for intelligentsia as a social group? Thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting question. In modern era, competitiveness is all present. Everything is changing very fast, and in pursuit of achieving result on preserving the social status, intelligentsia has to be competitive. And competitiveness thus becomes a characteristic trait not only of intelligentsia, but of society as a whole. Thank you. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, are there any more questions to the applicant? I have a question. In the very beginning of the presentation, your first slide, you used the word intellectuals, meaning intelligentsia. What's the difference between these two terms, and does the term intellectual work for your thesis? I would like to say that the translation of my thesis was far from professional, and probably there were certain typos, certain mistakes even in the use of the vocabulary. Probably it would have been better to use the term intelligentsia instead of intellectuals. Dear colleagues, are there any more questions to the applicant? If none, then we'll proceed with the reviews of the members of the Dissertation Council. And the reviews are the appraisal of the thesis. And then the applicant will provide responses. The applicant might provide response after each of the reviews, or provide responses after all the reviews are voiced. If possible, I would like to provide response after all the reviews are voiced. Thank you. The choice is yours. Then we'll agree that the applicant will provide response after all the reviews are voiced. Have you received any external reviews? None. Then I'd like to give the floor to the members of the Dissertation Council. I would like to say that since all the reviews were published on St. Petersburg State website, and this is open information, and the access is not limited, I would like to ask the members of the Dissertation Council to voice only the key aspects of the reviews. Comments, questions, remarks. Are there any objections? None. Thank you. Then we'll proceed with voicing the reviews. I would like to give the floor to Yelena Tarando. Thank you very much. My review was published on the website and I'll be very brief. I'd like to say that I like the thesis, and I'd like to thank the applicant and the supervisor, Mikhail Vladimirovich, for the thesis of high quality. The work is relevant, it has theoretical value and practical value and novelty. Nevertheless, I would like to voice certain comments. First, the applicant formulates one single hypothesis. Nevertheless, it's clear that there were multiple hypotheses. That's why I'd like to know what are the other hypotheses, maybe smaller ones, less comprehensive ones. Then, in accordance to the plan of the research, the survey was conducted in 2021, and we know that it was the time when COVID restrictions were in place in St. Petersburg. Nevertheless, there is no information about the limitations and their influence on the sports leisure of intelligentsia. 3. Appendix 2 does not provide comprehensive results of the survey, but only social demographic characteristics of the sampling. The above-mentioned remarks do not undermine the value of the work. The thesis, Sport Socialization of the Russian Intelligentsia, corresponds to the requirements established by St. Petersburg State University, and the applicant, Gonashvili Aleksandr Sergeevich, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of sociological studies, major 544, social structure, social institution processes. Clauses 9 and 11 were not violated. Thank you. Since the responses will be provided later on, I'll like to give the floor to the next member. Svetlana Resenka, the floor is yours. Dear colleagues, I was highly interested in the thesis, but currently sociology of physical education and sports is actively developing, and it's very pleasant that young researchers are focusing on it. The thesis is relevant, its theoretical and practical importance is beyond doubt, and I have a very positive outlook on the thesis. Nevertheless, I'd like to voice the following comments. The author should have been more specific when talking about the merging of relational sociology by Donati and the theory of social economy of labor by Elmeyev. The applicant provides only superficial information about that. The second comment. The applicant provides different definitions and approaches to defining leisure sport. But the author personal definition is not clear. Also, the issue of using the term sports leisure, if we talk about intelligentsia, is controversial. Very often, fitness is viewed as sport, but this is not absolutely equal to that term. Since intelligentsia is a complex, differentiated group, the author should have paid more attention to the characteristics of sports socialization and the strata forming its subgroups. What is more, the reference materials did not use legal basis, although the author talks about the necessity to change legislation. Nevertheless, the thesis is comprehensive work, and it complies with all the regulations of St. Petersburg State University. The applicant, Gonashvili Aleksandr Sergeevich, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of candidate of sociological sciences, major 544, social structure, social institutions and processes. Clauses 9 to 11 of the above-mentioned procedure were not violated. Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Lyubov Lebedentseva. Thank you very much, dear Chairperson, dear members of the Decision Council, dear guests. It was a pleasure for me to study the thesis by Aleksandr Sergeevich, and I believe that the topic is rather pressing nowadays, especially it became clear during the pandemic times. I'd like to say that the novelty of the thesis is definitely present, and in my review I talk in detail about it. I'm not going to voice all the positive remarks, since the review can be found on the St. Petersburg website. The thesis is divided into two parts, the theoretical and practical part. Many theoretical resources were analyzed. The research was conducted, and I was one of the respondents myself in the survey, by the way. As for the reliability of the results and the recommendations that the study offers, I would like to agree with the applicant that the practical importance of the work is evident. Nevertheless, I have a number of comments. I'm not going to voice my first question, which I have already mentioned, but I would also like Aleksandr Sergeevich to comment on the phrases that could be found at page 101, such as later practices, outweigh labor, and it no longer becomes center of social life. It's difficult for labor to provide a response to such an attack. And this is a very controversial idea. So I'd like to hear what the applicant might remark on it. The thesis, nevertheless, complies to the requirements of St. Petersburg State University, and the applicant deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of social studies, major 544. And now I'd like to give the floor to the professor from Ottawa, to Kristen Dalla. Kristen Dalla, the floor is yours. You might voice the main ideas from your view.
Pardon me, can you just repeat what you just said?
The floor is yours.
Oh, okay. I will, first, I want to thank you for inviting me to participate on this committee. And since my comments and questions have been published, I will not go through everything that's been already publicly available. I want to focus mainly on two main questions. My understanding is that Aleksandr is going to respond to the reviews altogether at the end. So I guess the first larger question for me was, why justify the use of the concept and the group of intelligentsia as a common group rather than looking at different social classes? Because you do explain in the thesis about how this social group of the intelligentsia covers different forms. Some of them seem to be closer to the elite, some seem to be closer to the working class. So I'd like for you to speak a bit more about the diversity amongst the intelligentsia and why it remains a valid concept for the study. And the second question is related to that. It's related to the analysis of the survey results. I didn't see much distinction in the analysis that draw out the experiences of the intelligentsia compared to the other respondents of the survey. My understanding is that the survey had a larger population of respondents. And so I look forward to hearing what you will have to say about that later on. And as the others, I would like to confirm that the thesis meets the requirement.
Thank you.
And finally, I would like to give the floor to Professor Dodzi from Hungary. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and also thank you for inviting me to the defense and the committee. As the others, yes, I also try to just highlight the most important information. So it's certainly a relevant research topic that has scarcely been examined in this context. The introduction presents a valid justification. So it's nice that it tries to combine and complement the international and the domestic, the Russian literature. And Actually, that was a general comment from my side that maybe the chapters could have been further divided. This might be an advice for future research work to be able to guide the reader a little bit more. I think, in this I join some other co-reviewers of me that I would also like to hear a little bit more information about the sample and how much it is actually connected to the intelligentsia, because for me it wasn't clear. I think the theoretical part offered actually a lot more depth than the empirical part of the thesis, and I think that the research was actually more focused on sporting habits and not that much on sports socialization, although that was also, I mean, included in some questions. Also, I join with a comment about the hypothesis that it was a really big and comprehensive one, and I think as such, it's not really easy to check, but it's rather like a working hypothesis or a thesis sentence, something like that. And then, yes, I think it could have been, some of the results maybe could have been connected to other countries to have an international comparison, although I know it's not always easy to do that because of the different understanding of sport and physical activity and physical exercise, and even within one language, sometimes it gets tricky. So it would have been nice to have a few 2-3-dimensional or more of the 2-3-dimensional analysis of the results. I was missing that a little bit, but overall the topic is relevant. The theoretical conceptual part of the dissertation is very, very rich and high standard, and of course the thesis follows the requirements of the dissertation. So I think the applicant deserves to be awarded the academic degree of candidate of sociological sciences in the 5.4.4 program. Thank you.
Thank you. Спасибо.
Thank you, dear colleagues, for your reviews. Now it's time for me to voice my review. A person is a comprehensive creation, and comprehensiveness develops because of different social processes, mechanisms, and institutions, and all of them of crucial importance. And a very important aspect of social mechanism can be seen in sport socialization. And the topic of the thesis, thus, is relevant. In my review, I talk about the reliability of the results obtained, of the novelty of the research. If we talk about the novelty, I liked the idea of sports leisure, how it was defined, and to differentiate sports practices from professional sports, since professional sport is not a part of leisure activities. And I believe that this is a very positive trait of the thesis. I like the concept of sports socialization, which tests, in a way, tests biological, psychological, social, and spiritual state with the use of the public appraisal system, typical for the area of sports. I find this characteristics interesting, and the relational approach to the problem of socialization was also appropriate. And the empirical data demonstrates the leisure practices by Russian intelligentsia. In the thesis, the author says that sports activities are based on the structural characteristics and social aspects. Scholarship was provided for this research. The analysis of data allowed to form certain practice-oriented recommendations. I believe that the results of the thesis might prove to be useful for future university courses at the level of baccalaureate programs, for students in the major of sociology, economics, and some others. The materials of the thesis might be used further on to conduct comparative analysis of socialization of different social groups. And it's very important that it can help to develop programs to appeal to the citizens, to promote healthy lifestyle, to promote humanistic values of sports. Nevertheless, I do have certain comments. I have voiced one of the comments about the translation of the terms intellectuals and intelligentsia and the difference between these two words. What is more, the author gives different definitions of the term sport. The thesis itself focuses on one interpretation of this term. The author talks about the appendices, and in the text the author says on page 131, nevertheless the appendices do not have a detailed analysis of the answers of the respondents. The graduate of St. Petersburg State University, Vasily Yakovlevich Ilmeyev, the founding father of applied sociology, the head of the School of Social Development, was viewed by Aleksandr Sergeevich as a very important figure in domestic science. But I don't understand how the relational sociology by Donati, how is it combined with the theory of the social economy of labor by Yilmeyev. So we need clarification at this point. Nevertheless, the general overview of the thesis is positive. Thus, the thesis is a well-grounded scientific work and complies with the requirements of St. Petersburg State University for major 544, social structure, social institutions and processes. Finally, I'd like to say that taking into account the relevance and novelty of the research, the thesis by Gonashvili on topic sport socialization, Russian intelligentsia, problems, challenges, controversies, complies to the main requirements of St. Petersburg State University, number 11181/1. And the applicant Gonashvili Aleksandr Sergeevich deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Candidate of Sociological Sciences, Major 544, Social Structure, Social Institutions and Processes. Clauses 9 and 11 of the above-mentioned order were not violated by the applicant. Thank you for your attention. And now I would like to give the floor to the applicant. Thank you very much, dear members of the Council, for the questions. I familiarized myself with the reviews. And there were about 25 questions that I was asked. First, I wanted to provide answers question by question and decided to group them into topic blocks to avoid repetition.
Мою логику понимания поставленных проблем таким образом получилось 5 блоков, с которыми я...
Thus, I got 5 blocks of questions. Five groups of questions. First, we focus on clarification of certain concepts. Etymologically, the word sport has roots in the Old French language, means pleasure entertainment. Historically, sports have long been a recreation form of activity and characterize the leisure activities of the privileged groups of society, the ruling elite. Under capitalism, sports leisure gradually penetrates the masses of society, but it develops different forms, including physical culture. Despite the fact that physical culture is a very broad concept, and it includes such ideas as physical education, physical training, physical activity, I did not identify a single definition of physical culture in sport. But I would like to single out 3 main groups of thoughts and ideas about sports and physical culture. Sport is a specific concept of physical culture. Physical culture and sports are independent concepts. And the third idea is that physical culture can be identified with motor activity, which include practices associated with motor activity. It's difficult to talk about sports and physical culture as a whole, since the idea of physical culture is contradictory. The word culture is a collective word. There is no culture as such. It doesn't have any ontological character. It's not a given thing. If we consider it in the Plato philosophical understanding, the key and important feature of understanding of sports and the difference from physical culture is its social basis. Sports, in its essence, cannot be outside the social context. Focusing on social aspect of sports, we use social leisure in the thesis.
Которое представлено разнообразными видами физических упражнений, а также любительским и массовым спортом. Так?
According to the research, we identified the following rating and popularity of sports. Athletics, in particular running, being most popular. Then going to the gym, swimming, cycling, and only then aerobics and fitness. According to the survey, about 11% of respondents are engaged in fitness. In the framework of an empirical study, respondents consider sport to be a manifestation of a healthy lifestyle. Sports is mostly associated with such concepts as endurance, willpower, and purposefulness. And the logic of the thesis was based on the fact that sports, first of all, is a sphere of production of public good. Thanks to sport leisure, human capital is improved. Nowadays, it is of special significance. Sports is a very important aspect of identity and is directly related to individualism. A person expresses themselves through running, aerobics, cycling and so on, which shows that sport produces a public good which should be supported by the state. Sports produces public good. It is a social activity which has specific educational opportunities. The next group of questions was related to methodology. And in particular, it was necessary to explain how I combined relations sociology and social economy of labor. These methods are consistent as an ontology of labor, relationship of intelligentsia, and the social measure of intellectual labor itself. The context in which social relations take place comes to the fore. The context allows to determine the structure of relations between people. It is, on the one hand, the manifestation of individual qualities of people. On the other hand, it is the result of accumulation of social values. As Donati says, society is a fabric of relations. The emergent reality of the relations is one of the key places in which the context of these relations takes place. It should be noted that because of the progressive development of the productive forces of material production, there is a reduction of working hours and the increase of free time. The labor has no value. The criteria of wealth is the amount of free time, not of working time. Thus, labor influences the development of the society, of the labor forces, the productive forces that are inherent to the society. The next group of questions is devoted to the research. I agree that I should have made the distinction between the main hypothesis and hypothesis of the investigation. I agree with the comments that the distinguished professors made. The difficulties of translating the thesis into English affected, unfortunately, the quality of the text. The translation was not professional due to the fact that English is not my native tongue, which raised a number of questions related to such expression as the spiritual culture of the Russian society, which includes a set of certain values and patterns which were discussed in the thesis. As for the appendices, we didn't add all the information to appendices, for we feared that the thesis would be too bulky because of more comprehensive appendices. But I would agree with the comments about the appendices. As for the concept of intelligentsia, I'd like to proceed from the fact that the emergence and formation of intelligentsia as a social special group was associated with the development of capitalism, which led to the increase in number and share of intelligentsia. And secondly, it increased the polarization of physical and mental labor. The history of the development of capitalist relations shows the continuous development of intelligentsia as a special social stratum. This is due to the fact that intelligentsia does not have sufficient unity and ideology. It can share the ideas of different classes and might be included in particular social stratum, as is evidenced by the increase in the quantitative growth of representatives of the group, as well as the growth of its share in the overall balance of the population society. Intelligentsia has a separate niche among other classes joining the bourgeoisie. Intelligentsia also belongs, in its essence, to the group of wage workers. With the development of capitalism and its influence on the position of intelligentsia, it turns intelligentsia into a more independent group, less dependent on wages. Thus, there is a certain contradiction which can be manifested in the social position of intelligentsia. Intelligentsia, as a social community, is subject to the influence of the main classes of capitalist societies. There are groups in intelligentsia that gravitate towards the main classes of society, to the middle and ruling classes of the society as well. Today, it can be noted that there is significant difference in the position of intelligentsia, since an increasing part of intelligentsia comes into conflicts with the monopolies and policies of the states. Various ideological and other social tensions lead the group of intelligentsia to the path where part of it remains committed to the ideals of the rural majority and parts of it act as non-conformists. The feature of the intelligentsia is the lack of clarity in different niches of public life, which is due to the individualistic nature of the work of intelligentsia, which leads to the fact that the solidarity is not fully developed in the group of intelligentsia. Thus, the idea that formed in the Russian society in the beginning of the 20th century, that intelligentsia is a social group that worries about the interests of society, that strives to serve the welfare, education and knowledge of the society, was narrowed down to the civic activity and began to be identified exclusively with a struggle against the existing socio-economic order. And intelligentsia has become identified as a group of people opposed to the existing political system. Later, in Soviet time, this feature of intelligentsia evolved and was revised. The diversity of the content of the concept of Russian intelligentsia indicates that it cannot be regarded as a stable phenomenon, an unchanged phenomenon. Consequently, we come to the conclusion that the problem of defining the Russian intelligentsia lies in the historic form, in the pattern of development of form of human life and reflection of social reality in a particular historical period. And finally, I'd like to answer the questions about the pandemic. All the goals and objectives of the thesis were set before the pandemic. Therefore, as a part of empirical study, issues related to sports practices during the pandemic period were not studied in the thesis. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the distinguished members of the Dissertation Council for their deep and interesting analysis of my work. Thank you. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear colleagues, is everybody satisfied with the responses the applicant provided? I'm satisfied. Fully satisfied, thank you. Yes, thank you. As far as I understand, the colleagues are satisfied with the responses. Then we can proceed with the next stage.
Проведение защиты. Речь идет о выступлениях, присутствующих в зале на защите диссертации, но не входящих в состав Диссертационного совета лиц. Не более 2 минут на каждого. Есть ли желающие выступить?
I can give the floor to those present in the hall. If you wish, you can have the floor. Vladimir Petrovich Miletsky, Professor, the Faculty of Sociology, St. Petersburg State University. Turn on the microphone, please. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, Chairperson and the members of the Decision Council. I would like to say that this is not my first review of Aleksandr Sergeevich's thesis. I participated in the pre-defense, and since the times after the pre-defense, we can see that the applicant has made progress. And what we see now is comprehensive research. The topic of the thesis was well defined, and the unique influence of the researcher is also visible through this work. I would like to say that I think that this topic is very close to me, since I was interested in sport, starting from my youth. I was practicing athletics. I was running a marathon of 3,000 meters, even have the sports a certificate. And when later on I served in the military, I continued practicing sport professionally. And at the championship among military personnel in 1973 in Kaunas, I participated in the competition and became the master of sports of Soviet Union. And while working at university, I was the scientific advisor of 2 candidates of sciences. So 2 now candidates of sciences worked on their thesis with my assistance. One at St. Petersburg State University, another at the Russian Academy of Governmental Policies. Both works were dedicated to the role of sports for the society. As for sports socialization, I would like to say that there is a thesis that revolution has the beginning but has no end. I would like to say that this is true about sports socialization. It has a beginning but has no ending. Those who start discussing these ideas work on sports socialization for the remaining part of their lives, and I hope that the applicant will be working on sports socialization and researching this topic further on. I'd like to say a few words on the content of the thesis. The applicant, after the pre-defense period, improved the thesis. And today we can see the final version of the research and the provisions for the defense are novel. And since I'm interested in the topic of sports sociology, the ideas that the author expresses are very useful for the development of this sphere. And I believe that the applicant deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of sociology. And our department focuses on the research work in the field. Among my postgraduate students, about 5 or 6 postgraduate students defended the scientific degree in the area of sports sociology. Several defended their doctorate degrees in the topic. Thus, I can compare the work by the applicant with other theses and works carried out by other postgraduate students, which I supervised. Thank you very much. Who else would like to request the floor? Now we might voice the questions which we received via email. As a result of the feedback by the listeners, we did not receive any questions via the email. Since Vladimir Petrovich had no comments and remarks, there is no necessity for the applicant to provide response. But if you wish to provide some answers, then you're welcome. First of all, I'd like to thank the supervisor. When the supervisor said that I gained something, I was a bit worried because I thought that I became overweight. But it wasn't about that, so thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Mikhail Vladimirovich. Mikhail Vladimirovich, please. The floor is yours. You have no more than 3 minutes. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. First of all, I'd like to thank all the members of the Dissertation Council for providing their views on the thesis. Especially, I'd like to thank our colleagues from abroad. The function of a supervisor is basically to provide the characteristics not of the work itself, not of the thesis itself. And I do possess information about the work, no less than all the other members of the Dissertation Council. But I would like to focus on the personality traits of the applicant. In a way, I'd like to say that I was lucky to work with Aleksandr Sergeevich. We've been cooperating for 8 years, starting from the second of the baccalaureate program, 2 years of master's program, and 3 years of postgraduate studies. I've been lucky to cooperate with the applicant. We write different reports on our work with the students. And very often, I didn't have to look for dozens of other students because I had Aleksandr Sergeevich, for he was a very prolific student and he achieved much. In particular, he participated in international conferences. For example, the conference in Budapest, where we went together. Don't remember when it was exactly. That was the conference of the International Association of Sports Sociology. Multiple published works. I suppose that about dozens of published works annually. including publications in foreign magazines. What is more, Aleksandr Sergeevich constantly applies for grants and scholarships, and now won the scholarship of the Russian Foundation of Fundamental Research for the research which was linked to the topic of the thesis. Aleksandr Sergeevich received different awards, certificates for his research activity. But as for the personality of the applicant, I would like to characterize the key character traits. The applicant is a hard-working person, very reliable and responsible, very communicative, very quick at taking decisions. And now we're dealing with a thesis that could be defended several months later. But as a sprinter, as a short-distance runner, Aleksandr Sergeevich decided to defend the thesis as early as possible. When we started working together from year 2 of the baccalaureate program, Aleksandr was characterized by such aspect as aiming at academic activity. I suppose the applicant, when entering the university, saw himself working at university as a lecturer at university, I suppose. So I believe that Aleksandr Sergeevich will be successful in further academic activity, and he's a good specialist in sociology. And I'm sure that he will become a good researcher in the future as well. Dear colleagues, who else would like to request the floor? And before we proceed, I would like to ask the members of the Decision Council and the applicant. Do the members of the Decision Council and the applicant have any comments or questions or objections on the procedure of the conducting of the meeting, including the remote access mode? No objections and no questions. I would like to request all the members of the Decision Council to answer this question. No objections, no questions. Dear colleagues, in the remote access mode, do you have any objections or questions on the procedure?
Oh, I don't.
Наши коллеги, да, говорят, что нет.
Then we'll move into the roll call. And I'd like to ask the members of the Decision Council. Prior to the open roll call, we have the opportunity to declare a break, if necessary, to discuss the results of the defense with muted sound of the broadcast. How do you think, dear colleagues, do we require such a break in order to discuss the results of the defense? No, there is no need. No, there's no need. No, there is no need. Since there is no need, we will continue our meeting. And we'll move into the voting procedure. It is necessary that the opinion of each member of the Decision Council is voiced publicly and independently. Now it's 5 o'clock, 29 minutes Moscow time. And I raise the question of awarding Aleksandr Sergeevich Gonashvili an academic degree of Candidate of Sociological Sciences in Scientific Major 544, Social Studies, Structures, Scientific Institution and Processes. I raise the question for an open roll call. I would like to emphasize that by voting for, each member of the Decision Council agrees that clauses 9 and 11 of the order were not violated. I would like to quote the thesis by the applicant. In the thesis, the applicant is required to cite the source of materials or quantitative results. The applicant has to note if he worked and achieved the result of the research together with other researchers. I'd like to remind you that the decision of the Decision Council on the issue of awarding scientific degree is positive if no fewer than 3 members of the Decision Council voted for it. And now I would like to request each member of the Decision Council to voice their opinion. Lebedin Sevelubov Aleksandrovna, your opinion. Do you vote for or against? I vote for. Thank you. Thank you. Yelena Tarando. I vote for awarding the scientific degree. The member of the council, Svetlana Rosenko. Your opinion, please. I vote for. Thank you. Christine Daller. Your opinion, please.
I vote for.
Thank you. And the member of the council, Tamas Dodzi. Your opinion, please.
I vote for.
And finally, I, the chairperson of the council, Prua Nikolai, vote for. Awarding Aleksandr Sergeevich Gonashvili the academic degree of the Candidate of Sociological Sciences in Scientific Major 544. Now we start the vote count. All the members of the Decision Council expressed their opinions. Dear colleagues, dear guests, I'd like to announce that out of 6 participants in the voting procedure, voted for 6 people, voted against none, abstained none. The decision to award Gonashvili Aleksandr Sergeevich the degree of Candidate of Sociological Sciences in Scientific Major 544, Social Structure, Social Institutions and Processes, is adopted. I would like to give the floor to the applicant for the closing remarks. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the members of the Dissertation Council for their recommendations and for their support. Thank you very much. Also, I'd like to thank the faculty, the Department of Sociology, for the knowledge that it bestowed on me. I would especially like to thank my family, my relatives, my friends, who supported me in my quest of the scientific degree. Now, some of my friends are present in here, some are watching the broadcast. Thank you very much. Finally, I would like to thank my scientific supervisor, without whom today's defense wouldn't be possible and would have taken place. Mikhail Vladimirovich taught me a lot, especially to think critically, to act practically. Thank you very much for such support. Our cooperation was not always smooth, but thank you very much for all your work and for all your help. Now we'd like to congratulate the applicant. Dear colleagues, everybody present, I declare the meeting closed. I'd like to thank you all for participation. Please turn off the broadcast.